are live once again. Welcome back to the Placemakers. You are joining me during my favorite time of the week. It's when I get to hang out with my friends who are cooler and smarter than your friends to talk about the future of higher education. Today, we have got a wild and special episode for you. First of all, we've got two return guests. We've got Kelsey Harmon Finn, who's the CEO of NACAS, and we've got Clayton Mitch Mitchell from Thomas Jefferson. And they've both been on the show. You're both fan favorites. And Kelsey reached out with a really crazy idea, and I think it's a great idea. And that's, we're going to do a little bit of a role reversal. So I'm going to hand over the reins to the show. We're going to make Kelsey Harmon Finn the host for the week. And I get to try to keep up with Mitch and answer some of the questions that Kelsey has about the future of higher education. So without further ado, let's hand it over to Kelsey. You are now the host.
Awesome. Thanks, TJ. I'm going to chalk this up to careful what you ask for opportunity. So thank you. I appreciate you taking a chance and having this conversation. And I'll put it out there. You know, there's been 12 episodes, a dozen episodes or so, I think, in the Placemakers, and listen to all of them. And I don't know, some of you out there might be thinking, well, what's TJ's answer to this question? He's got questions. There's some ideas. So I thought, let's ask him some questions. And he said, let's bring along my friend Mitch so we can both answer questions. So here we are.
Alone on this.
Yeah, right. It's a group effort, team effort. We're all in this together. And I really think when I was thinking about this time and space, and even from the time I was on the podcast a couple of months ago, what has changed in that short amount of time and the rapid pace? It's like we're moving in rapid pace and we're in slow motion all at the same time. At least that's what I feel like. So we have change, we have the way our brains work and what our brains need. And I think we have our egos at play here. And when we talk about what's going on college campuses, all of those pieces play a role. And so I really want to start, and I want to dig into the piece around silos. I think it's been a theme through the podcast, why we have silos, the impact silos have on campus. We're talking about space, education, what we do on campus. So talk to me about how we break down those silos, or what you all are doing related to, breaking down the silos on your campus. TJ, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. Silos have come up as a theme in the podcast, as something that, as we look around the corner in higher ed, that's going to have to change. We're going to have to break those things down. When you ask me, how do you attack that on your campus? I think the first thing is really to identify what is the source of those things. I've referred a bunch of folks to this specific episode of a podcast that I love called The Hidden Brain. They did an episode called Bullshit Jobs at one point, and it was great. It really did target higher ed a little bit, and it talked about the way that higher ed has invented jobs for the sake of justifying and propping up other jobs. And I think that's one of the direct sources of some of the siloing that's happened is, if you want to be an associate dean, you got to be able to supervise X number of people. And so we have to create those jobs to put those jobs there. And we end up in these situations where it's about fiefdoms. Higher ed is founded on being gatekeepers of knowledge, being gatekeepers of resource. It's a very, very old model that never really changed to be relevant with how information flows today. I tell my kids this all the time. I'm less interested in you knowing the answer and more interested in you knowing how to find it. But that's not the leadership model in higher education. The leadership model is I have all the stuff, and that puts me at the top. And if you need the stuff, you have to come get it from me. And we never went and turned that around and said, you know what, now you have all the stuff, and my job is to help put you in a position to use the stuff in the best way. I think that would be the first way to break down those silos, is to turn philosophically that thing on its head. So it's not about what I have. It's more about how I help you use what we collectively have in a really effective way.
I think from my perspective,
Mitch, you were talking about this a little bit earlier, I think, right?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. I think from my perspective, and I'll put a little bit of different twist on the backside with the ego part of what you talked about, Kelsey. We're all we get vested in our specializations. I'm a specialist of this. This is my department. And that, I think, lends itself to creating these fiefdoms that TJ just talked about. And I think earlier I was kind of talking about the need for integrators versus specialists. And I don't know that we've developed that academic experience that really focuses on how do people integrate all of these different aspects and disciplines together to sort of make an integrated solution to some of the world's problems that we have today. We're taught to, put a round a peg into a square hole. but now we have different types of issues that require a more systemic type of thinking, an integrated type of thinking. That I don't know that the structure of our universities as they are today are aligned there. Now you look at schools like Stanford and other schools that are exploring different ways of how to cobble education together. I think Jefferson has made some big inroads in that place, and I think that is the potential future. But I believe that there's a long ways to go to really knock down a lot of those bigger silos. I think just really quick. One way that that's been effective for me to at least sort of mitigate them a little bit is active listening and really focusing on what is the need that my partner is looking to fill, and how might I introduce ways and concepts that they might not have even thought of to sort of to shift that thinking a little bit and bring some of that integrated thinking to the table.
Mitch, I wonder, in addition to this notion of sort of listening to what people's goals are, why don't we have more commonly shared goals? I struggle when I sit in meetings where there are unit heads from functional areas, and you look around and everybody's got their own personal, almost self-serving goal sometimes. And I wonder how we get over that hump of getting everybody on the same page. Well, this is our collective goal.
This is just back from my military experience. There's an overarching national security objective, but every commanding officer has a command philosophy, which is their vision for how that organization operates. And I got into the habit of saying, okay, that's the commanding officer's vision, what we call commander's intent. What is my vision in terms of how am I going to deliver that? What my part of that is. And so you get into this habit, or I got into this habit of developing tiered visions. And right now I'm trying to drive a lot of my team to develop those visions too, so that they're not in discord, they're in accord. They're aligned towards that common vision. But our leaders have to establish that vision first. And that may be the crux of some of our challenges, is that what we think are visions are really mainly, maybe just platitudes and mantras and sayings, but there's no real constructive vision for people to sort of bite into, rally around, and build a vision to achieve that greater vision.
So I think that's a great point around visionary leadership, and probably a missing piece in a lot of ways in higher education. So TJ, I think you've mentioned this before, but who are visionary leaders in higher education right now that are really trying to move the ship in a different direction?
Yeah, I think that's part of the struggle. Is we did a show with Brandon Bustede and asked a very similar question, and he was able to rattle off a bunch, but at the end of the day, they represent such a small piece of the puzzle in terms of industry wide having dynamic leadership. Michael Sorrell always comes to mind for me from Paul Quinn. He's just sort of out there leading in ways that are very innovative and thoughtful, and he clearly has the support of his board in being able to execute on his vision. People like that, and there are certainly others. There's no question about it. I just really like to highlight his work because it is so sort of different and out there. The one piece that you said there in the question that I think is interesting is, I think you referred to the industry as sort of a ship on the, a ship, like we're big, we're this, everybody calls it a ship on the ocean. And I always think, I had a friend make this analogy to me and it stuck with me forever. They said higher education is an elephant of an industry. And when you think about a cat or an elephant, you'd say, well, which one's more fragile? And most people would say the cat is more fragile because it's much smaller. And they said, no. If you drop a cat from 10 feet, what happens? Well, it lands on its feet and it walks away. If you drop an elephant from 10 feet, what happens? It might even die. I mean, it's going to be a problem, right? And so their point was that as an elephant of an industry, we're so big, we're so monolithic, and we're so leveraged off of just a couple of different things. And it's so interesting to see how that's made us fragile, that a pandemic that essentially says your model is bring people together and charge them an exorbitant amount of money to do so. A pandemic that says people can't be together has completely unraveled the entire industry. That's how fragile we were, that a 4.5 month period in time has now completely unraveled the industry and exposed us in terms of exactly how fragile we are. And I think that's what I've been thinking about a lot, is that the industry is extremely fragile and now has been exposed. And what happens next now that we've refused to pivot over the last several months?
So the question that comes to Go ahead,
Well,
Mitch.
I'm just going to tag on to what TJ mentioned. We had this conversation about students as customers and consumers. And so we've somewhat lost sight of that, or we really never had that as the center. And now students are beginning to make more demands. I think one of the challenges, though, is is the purpose of the education to get a job or to develop these skill sets that can be relevant throughout your entire career? Because we also talked about the evolution of careers. And I think, my thing with my own kids is, guys, you know what? You're going to probably have to reinvent yourselves 5, 6, 7 times during the course of your career. So what you learned in school the facts and the details may become irrelevant, but the experiences are what's going to help you understand how to promote that evolution as you go through life.
So that makes me think of, how are we helping students, individuals, become more emotionally intelligent, better problem solvers, potentially risk takers? And Mitch, I think you used this term earlier, critical thinkers, right? Because the idea is, how are you critically thinking? How are you bringing together all of these ideas and moving something forward? So something that comes to mind when I'm listening to you all talk and we talk about this ship is, higher education works on 5 to 10 year strategic plans, and we want everything well thought out and long and drawn. And we're, kind of to your elephant comment, we're in the place where I don't think you get to think 5 to 10 years out. Everything's moving so much faster and changing. Even if you think about the last decades, though it wasn't a health pandemic, we've had what we would call economic crisis, other things happening. So how do you stay nimble and relevant if you're planning in 5 to 10 year cycles? You have any thoughts on how we actually shift the cycle of planning or stay nimble and relevant?
I was going to let Mitch go. Mitch is always thinking about strategic planning. I know that.
I like it.
I think, I agree with you, Kelsey. We need to be thinking in 10-year terms, but in my mind, there's this art and science of thinking out 10 years ahead. This is a cool thing about working for Dr. Klasko, because he's out there. And so you need people who can go to where the visionary is and say, okay, this is what he's trying to do, and then come back to earth and actually put the plans to make that work. And I think, again, it goes back to how we're educated. We're educated to find the absolute answer to all of our questions. At least that's what I was taught as an engineer. And when you get out into the world, you find out that there is no absolute answers to a lot of questions. There's politics, there's diversity, there's all these issues that affect what the real answer will be. And so critical thinking is about, knowing that, hey, there's a 75, 80% directionally correct that I need to go, and that's okay. I don't need 75, 60% of the information to make a decision. If I have a vision and the decision is directionally correct, then I can start moving in that way. For education, though, that is an institution that I think has been just really entrenched in the current way of thinking. And I go back to thinking that our education environment is based on developing factory workers, figuratively, right? That there isn't a perfect answer. You learn these processes, you remember these facts, and you can go out and you can get employed. That used to be the case. That's no longer the case.
Right.
So I think I don't have that perfect answer for you, Kelsey, but for me, it's like, how do I develop myself in a way that I'm constantly thinking and evolving, right? And able to create a vision and able to move towards that vision. And I think education and academia has to do that as an institution.
Yeah, and I would say a couple of things on that. One, I would say, what are we doing to create lifelong learners? What are we doing I think higher ed habitually is bad at creating environments where it's safe to fail. And teaching people how to fail forward, just down to the way that we indoctrinate and then measure your progress and measure your success. The unit of measurement of learning is literally time. It's if I spend X amount of time, X amount of hours doing X, I earn X amount of credit hours toward this degree. And I think in today's world, how absurd that is, how absurd it is that a measurement of time and that there's some notion that I can learn things in the same amount of time that Mitch can. Mitch is clearly smarter than me. Mitch can learn things much more quickly than I can. Why are we in the class for the exact same amount of time, with the outcome being a grade, which means there's no room for failure in that, right? And so I think part of it is just the whole structure of higher education. When I think about the strategic planning piece, I love what Mitch says about vision. I wish some of our visions were a little bit more thoughtful. I would love to see a university say, we want to be the most relevant university in the country, instead of we want to be a world-renowned university. Because world-renowned doesn't mean a whole lot to me. Relevant means a lot to me, because I think I can pin a lot of what I do to sort of relevance and how we educate people, how we deliver that education, what it costs to attend the institution. And it would tie into everything that we do. I know Mitch has a lot of oversight of buildings. Well, how many people or how many buildings over the course of your career have you built that are 100-year buildings? Yeah. Right? I have no idea what students are going to want in 5 years. What business do we have building a 100-year building right now? Right? That is exorbitant in terms of cost, exorbitant in terms of debt service. But people are still doing it right now today on their campuses. They're building 100-year buildings. And we don't know what students are going to want in 5 years. Back to your point of, my kids will probably have jobs that don't exist right now. So how are we educating them on the skill sets to have those jobs, not knowing what those jobs are going to be? You can't educate them to the answer. You got to educate them to the way to solve the problem.
Yeah. And those 100-year-long buildings are really expensive to build.
Oh yeah.
When I was on college campuses and we were building buildings, and I sat in those construction meetings, and they're like, well, it needs to hold up for 50 years. I'm like, wow. Yeah. Okay. So that's going to be that price versus that price. And the students today are paying or obligating students of the future for that cost when we're talking student fees, right? Mm-hmm. So we're also making promises for the future on that.
Well, now put the layer of COVID on top.
Let's talk about followers.
Well, I was going to say, put the layer of COVID on top. So we've said, we're going to obligate you to the future. And now we're in a situation where we're saying you're going to take a large majority of your classes online. You're already obligated to pay for things that you're not going to get to experience. And it's exposed things in terms of the cost of higher education. That's why there's this outcry nationally. Students are going, hold the phone. Zoom is not high quality. Online education is not high quality. I know it because I experienced it in the spring. You've already shown me that you didn't do anything over the summer to pivot to be better at it, and you're still gonna cut me out of the buildings that I'm paying for every single day. Yeah. The equation, the ROI doesn't make sense anymore. And so I think that's now where we find ourselves, is this is all expedited that conversation.
Yeah.
100%. And then on the back end, the way the financial model works is you've already spent that money. Those universities, that money is spent. So there isn't the ability to pivot expenses at a large scale, because you've pre-spent the money that they are supposed to be paying you, that they no longer can pay you or should be paying you, in my opinion, because they're not getting the services. So it's all kind of broken.
Well, we have these significant liabilities. We talked on the last time I was on this podcast about significantly increased deferred maintenance and other expenses. And those backlogs are just getting bigger and bigger. I mean, a lot of universities have $500 million, $1 billion backlogs. So at some point, those chickens are going to come home to roost. When we look at what's happening with COVID-19, most entities have had to sort of draw down their liquidity in order to get through this. So, the question as to whether there's going to be the capital capacity, I think the capital will always be there, but do the public institutions and the private institutions have the balance sheet to go out and get that capital to do the things they need to do to make themselves relevant in the future? And now that future's even more uncertain, because do I have too much infrastructure now? Is this right model of part online, part residence, a model that's going to stay with us out into the future? I think COVID, and I talked about this before, on the healthcare side, most of our hospitals are built to deal with infection control. So know that there's a lot that we need to do to adjust them, materially. But if the model says, wow, I'm going to do a lot of telehealth and I'm going to do a lot of remote learning now, and that model stays, then there's a whole lot of institutions that have to take an accounting of all of the assets they have and make hard decisions as to whether they're going to continue to invest in maintaining all of that infrastructure. It's going to normalize access to education for a lot of institutions. And so your buildings may not necessarily be, the deciding factor that they were before.
So one thing we know in research that we talk about a lot at NAC is students pick a college or university based on the way it feels, a fit and feeling, and they stay based on the out of classroom experience. But in this 22-minute conversation that we've had, we basically are saying we have too many buildings. I'm going to be a little extreme. Too many buildings. They're all falling apart. We have no money to pay for that. We've built huge teams of staff that just build upon each other, but we're not sure what skill sets they have if they actually match the future needs. And we probably have a hybrid model long term. And mix in with that, we're a follower industry. Higher education follows other folks. So who's going to step out and say, this has to change? And where do you start?
Well, I don't know that anybody's going to step out and say, other than people that are very prickly, to say that this has to change. I think what we're more likely to see is what we're already seeing. And that's that institutions that can afford to weather this storm are doing it, and are doing it well. And they're doing it in one of two ways. Like you look at the Cal system, you look at Harvard, they're going to weather the storm in a way that backs their values, where they say, your safety is number one to us. We're going online, deal with it. And they have enough money or low enough tuition, or the on-campus experience isn't a big enough portion of their revenue that they can afford to weather that storm and do that in a way that sort of retains their credibility. There's some other big campuses that can afford to move through the hybrid model, and they're going to continue to thrive. Scott Galloway actually just did a blog post this week where he categorized every school across a number of different factors in terms of who was going to survive, thrive, and who was going to perish. And it looks at a number of those things. So I think it's going to be less about people stepping out and say we need to change. I think, the thing about Galloway's model is that it assumes all things stay the same, that institutions continue along the path that they're continuing along. And I don't think that that's an unsafe or unfair assumption based on the history of higher education. We are change averse, we are risk averse. And it is an industry where people are doing everything they can to retain what is familiar to them. And so I don't think that's an unfair assumption at all. I don't know that anybody's going to necessarily, or at least large swaths of people are going to come out and say, hey, this needs to change and I'm going to lead the way. I think it's more likely that some are going to emerge and make it. Some are not going to make it. There's going to be some people in the middle that survive. And my biggest concern is that we create an even bigger gap in the United States with regards to access to higher education, or at least access to the traditional college experience, where the wealthy and privileged or a certain class of people have access and other people do not. And the only way that we're going to make sure that that doesn't happen is by partnering in really meaningful ways with corporate education or with situated learning to help drive that cost down from the outside in, because I don't know that it's going to happen from the inside out, with very, very few exceptions.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And, I think about the complexity of the society that we're in today, and the need for, I mentioned this before, integrators. And so how do we educate people to be integrators? How do we take an engineering curriculum, which I grew up in, and quite frankly, I didn't do a whole lot of liberal arts things as part of that education. But guess what? In my 30-year career, most of what I'm doing has as much liberal arts aspect to it as engineering. But the way that we're educated, if you're at an engineering school, oh, yeah, you know what? Liberal arts, that's the fuzzy stuff. No need for that. No need for history. No need for English. Right. And so I think we have to fundamentally take a step back and rethink that. Have we gone too far in creating specialists And have we not gone far enough to really create people who can really think in a very systemic, complex way, not just from a technical standpoint, but leveraging technical and liberal arts? I think if I look at what's happening in our politics, I just believe that, again, society is accelerating faster than any politician can manage it. And so the way that we instruct people in political sciences and things of that sort has to necessarily expand so that folks understand how our economy comes together and the interrelationship between rich and poor, technical, non-technical, all of these interrelationships that are really going to be important to drive us to a brighter future. We need those critical thinkers, those integrated thinkers, those systemic thinkers that were almost comparable to what we had with the founders. I mean, if you look at the founders, they were the integrators of their time. They had multiple things that they knew about the society. And then we went through a trough, and now we've got to figure out a way to get back to somewhat close to that model where we have folks who understand how economies work at a broader scale.
Well, and you used the buzzword for me, which is systemic. And I think it's an important word. It's a word that we're hearing a lot right now in our society. And I think higher education is a systemic issue. The way that we are structured is a systemic issue. Something really unpopular for me to say, I think tenure is a massive issue in terms of the restructuring of higher education. I shared with somebody earlier today that 73% of full-time faculty in the United States are white. And this, for the first year, will be the time that less than 50% of all college students or all college age students are white. And so now college age students no longer is white the majority of college students, but they are certainly the majority of our faculty members. That's not going to be undone for generations because of tenure and what it holds in place there. When I read that article, I think it was in the Chronicle by the faculty member who said, how do we make sure no faculty get cut? And talks about banding together and talks about ensuring that we protect one another. Nowhere in the article does it talk about students or student success or quality of teaching. It just talks about how do we protect ourselves. I don't know how we undo that. And that's why I continue to lean toward the outside. I think that the way that this is going to change is from the outside in. I think that it's going to be, whether it's the Googles of the world or the Amazon, there's going to be some disruption that has to happen from the outside. And I hate to say that I've given up hope, but I don't see a lot of hope for disruption from the inside unless it comes out of desperation after it's too late. That just seems to be the track record for higher ed.
Well, I think it's interesting, and I think that speaks a lot to accountability and how we hold each other accountable. And I will bring that ego piece back in, right? Tenure feeds the ego because I hold all the information, I teach you, you listen to me. I also think listening to the two of you talk, there's other things that come to mind. We're looking for where to place blame. And I don't think we're in a place where we need to blame anyone for anything. It's just, here's where we're at. So how do we get out of this pointing fingers and really think about how do we solve for the future? And I think when we talk about P3s, this blaming comes up. We use the term transfer of risk. Mm-hmm. So if campuses want to transfer risk to the business partner so that they have less risk, or who has the most risk? It's like, well, is that really how you go into partnership with someone and help shape the future of what we're trying to do? If we're just saying, well, who's going to be more at risk and where can I point the fingers, versus how do we actually solve for work readiness, the future of what we're trying to do, integrators to Mitch's piece. I think aren't those way more fun conversations to be having anyways than who am I going to blame when it all goes wrong?
Yeah. I think so. And I actually want to go back to TJ's point, really just in diversity. And we can think about racial diversity, ethnic diversity, all aspects of it. There's ideological diversity, and I think I think back to my time in the Navy. We didn't appreciate and recognize visionary thinking. That was not something that people checked on your performance reviews. And so over time, those thinkers left. And what was appreciated was maintainers, right? People who can maintain the status quo. And it was a very short-term, near-term focus that did not enable aspects, at least my aspects of that particular community, to expand and grow. And I think we're seeing elements of that in every industry, including academia, right? And so why is it very hard for a disruptor to grow up in that particular system? Because they get cut off pretty early. They haven't conformed. They haven't drank the Kool-Aid and walked the standard walk. The system, and this is the systemic part, through groupthink or however you want to sort of describe it, has self-selected the next generational leader over time. And so it's really hard to get evolutionary transformational change when that's your system of how you reward people.
TJ, I just said 100%. I agree.
Oh.
TJ, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree 100%.
Do you have anything to add?
No, I agree 100%. I think that Mitch is on the money with regards to the way that leadership is selected, the way that, what we value and what we reward. You'd asked me earlier, sort of, how do you do some of this stuff? How do you impact change on a college campus? And I think it's a challenging thing to do. And if I were to give anybody any advice on how to impact change, I would tell you to act in a way that doesn't always get rewarded in our field. And what I mean by that is, when Mitch said this earlier, that we reward people that fulfill orders. You're told to do X, you do X, you get rewarded for doing X. I like an equation where you're told to do X and you say, but why? Why are we doing X? Or how does X align with what we said we value? Or, putting ourselves in a position, one of the ways that I've articulated this to some of the folks on my teams is, that we're saying out loud what it is that we're really doing and how it aligns with what we say we care about, being values-based. And Julie Payne Kirchmeier talked about being values-based organizations when she was on the pod, and I couldn't agree more. But I think part of that is getting higher education leadership to actually say it out loud. Don't say, we value student safety, number one, no matter what, and then say, I'm going to do everything I can to get people back on campus no matter what. Because those two things probably conflict. And so you've got to resolve that for us and figure out how you're going to resolve that for us. And that's just one example amongst the many, 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 many decisions that we make within higher education on a regular basis.
Well, it's just real quick. My latest read is a book by Simon Sinek. It's called The Infinite Game, right? And it compares the infinite-minded leader versus the finite-minded leader. And if you were to sort of do a poll, I think you'd probably see something like a 95-5 cut. I said that to someone and they go, Mitch, you're being too generous. But how do we create more infinite-minded leaders? Because those are the ones that are going to look beyond the current boundaries and constraints that we're in today and find those opportunities to move the organization forward. And it has to happen through disruptors. We can't have this automaton, Stepford Wives type approach to developing leaders in any organization going forward. I think we see today the ills of going down that path.
And I think people that are listening to podcasts are who are needed. Mindset I like to talk about, we lead from scarcity and fear versus an abundance. And how do we show up from a place of abundance for each other and with each other? And that work takes energy. So I don't want to go too far over the 30 minutes because, as TJ says, no podcast is good after 30 minutes, and we're already at 35.
I make an exception when you're the host.
Okay, thanks. But I will, in staying with your tradition, I would like to give one final question, and we're going to mix it up a little bit because I think in this time when you really are a disruptor and you're trying to do different and you're showing up every day, that takes a lot of energy, whatever that is for you as a person. So what I love for you all to share with our guests or people listening are, what do you do to take care of yourself to keep showing up in this way, day in and day out? And I'm going to start with Mitch because I feel like you know your answer, and we'll go to TJ last.
Well, first I got to tell you, I lived my dream. I mean, at 7 years old, I told my dad that I wanted to build stuff. And he said, architects build stuff. So I go, okay, I think I want to be an architect. Hey, I switched to engineering, but it's the same thing. So every day I do the things that I've been wanting to do since I was 7 years old. So this is, I probably shouldn't say this with my boss, earshots of my boss. This is fun to me. I mean, this is the ultimate challenge. This is the ultimate Rubik's Cube, right? And I've been at the Navy, which was 300,000, 500,000 people, Kaiser Permanente, $80 billion entity. So I like large organizations. I love complexity, and I love figuring out how to get organizations to shift. So that's I go through the weekend waiting for Monday morning to get here so I can get back at it. But I will tell you, one of the things I do is I turn off during the weekend. And so on the weekends, I in fact, what's really hard now is I have to learn how to work from home again, because I promised my wife I would stop working from home, and I did that. And so now I have to sort of relearn some of that. But I think just loving what you do, having a lot of passion, helps get you through it.
Well, I would echo some of what Mitch said, particularly loving what you do. The things that get me through, keep me going, because you're right, this is a challenging time. I think it's a challenging time for the industry. I think I had a conversation with a colleague today about why I think it might be a particularly challenging time, and it's that the industry right now, by and large, is making decisions on a 24-hour cycle. We wake up every day and make new decisions, and we react. And one of the comments I made was, imagine had we made some decisions in March and we could have spent months being proactive to be something exceptional by now. But we didn't do that. Instead, we wake up every day on fire and we run around. So I acknowledge this is a particularly difficult time in the industry. The thing that keeps me going, the things that keeps me showing up and caring, it's going to sound crazy to say it here, but it's this podcast. I get to come on here every week and I get to talk with people that are way smarter than I am. And I get to learn every single week from amazing people. And one context of a job, I'm able to think a little bit bigger than that. And that's been not just a lot of fun, but very, very fulfilling for me, because I've heard from listeners, we're in 11 countries now. We have thousands and thousands of downloads. We've heard from listeners about how much they enjoy this conversation and how it's really caused them to think a little bit differently. And that's what keeps me going, is that we all have the ability to make a bigger impact if we find the channels to do it.
I couldn't agree more. And I think it always feels great to not feel alone. And so when you're having the conversations and you're able to hear where people are thinking creatively and willing to share ideas for the greater good, it feels good and it's motivating. And so thank you, TJ, for doing the podcast. Thank you for taking a chance on me tonight. Mitch, thank you for last minute joining in with us in short notice. And I appreciate you both. Have a great evening.
And thanks to Kelsey for being a better host than I am. And hopefully we'll have her back again really, really soon. Good night, everybody. All right, Diamond should have us off.